In the last video, I talked about the reasons some apologists and some believers give for why someone like me might not believe in God, despite all the evidence that they present to them. If you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link in the description, but this video should mostly be okay on its own, with the exception maybe of a few little references. So in this video, I wanted to take a look at some of the best evidence according to Christians and explain why I don't accept this evidence. Hey everybody, thank you so much for liking and subscribing and commenting and all the other awesome stuff you do. I put the links down below for the social media as well as the Patreon and the link to the episode of Leave It the Beaver, where Beaver turned out to be a werewolf and they had to put him down. So let's start with some of the worst of the best arguments and work our way up.
The problem is not a lack of evidence. The problem is a lack of your will. You will not to know God. You are willingly ignorant of the fact that God created the world. You choose. You can see the creation. You know there must be a creator, and you are willingly choosing to be ignorant of this creator. I don't want him. I don't want to hear him. I don't want you to tell me about him. That's what you're saying.
This is the argument from just look around. This goes back to what I talked about in the last video. Based on the fact that there are a lot of different religions, we created gods to explain things that we didn't understand. And now we are turning around and using those things as proof that God exists.
There's this divide that it maybe is best explained by the analogy of eyes being open or closed. When you close your eyes, there's nothing in the room. And as long as you keep your eyes closed, I could say to you, prove to me that there's a painting in the room. I'm going to keep my eyes closed. It's going to be harder to prove that. Or I open my eyes, in which case I'm not even asking. And this is what often happens, I think, with skeptics. There's so much taken for granted as they begin their study for God. They begin looking for God, right? They look around at the universe. They look around at creation. They look around at their own life. They feel their own soul, their own being. They see beauty, morality, and goodness. And that's all just there without explanation for them. And then they turn to you and say, okay, now prove there's a God. And you're like, you're sort of starting from a place where you have missed all the evidence.
I've talked before about the soda sweating dragon. I walk into a room and I see a cup of delicious soda, and I take a sip of it and wonder where this thing could have come from. And then I come to the conclusion that there must be some sort of dragon out there that sweats soda. Just a sweaty dragon that sweats sweet, sweet soda. Then someone comes into the room and sees me drinking my soda, and I say, aren't you so glad that there is a soda sweating dragon out there making soda for us? What are you talking about, they'll say. And I'll look at them and I'll say, we get soda from a dragon that sweats soda. And they say, no, we don't. Really? Then how do you explain this soda? The evidence is right in front of you.
Okay. You've convinced me.
In other words, God's word tells us, if you don't believe in God, you're without excuse because it's so obvious there's a God. God has made it evident to all that he is the creator. Where has he made it evident to all? Well, we can see it's evident to all just in the creation. You know that if you find an Indian arrowhead in a cave, archaeologists will immediately say, oh, intelligence has been here. They carved this Indian arrowhead.
And this is the watchmaker argument, another very weak one. Why would he point out the arrowhead amongst everything in the cave? If we can tell that everything is created, then why use the one thing made by humans as the outlier, as something we notice right off the bat as being created?
Proof. I can give you pretty good proof, absolute scientific proof, in about 1 minute. Should we give it a try?
Sure.
Every building is proof of a builder. Every painting is scientific proof of a painter. We know that because a building cannot build itself, it's impossible, and a painting cannot paint itself. Builder could have died 100 years ago, but you know there was a builder because the building's there. Painter could have died 300 years ago, but you know there was a painter because paintings don't paint themselves. Creation is evidence of a creator. Flowers and birds and trees, the sun, the moon, the stars, puppies and kittens, male and female, the seasons, the fruits, all these things are evidence of the genius of God's creative hand.
There's this concept called the cosmic calendar. What you do is you take the age of the universe, currently believed to be about 13.787 billion years, and you condense that to a calendar year. It's a way to contextualize the history of the universe. New Year's Day at midnight is the Big Bang. At 12:30 in the morning on January 1st, the first atoms form. On January 26th, the first galaxies form. On March 1st, our galaxy forms. On September 9th, our solar system forms. On September 14th, the Earth and the Moon form. On December 5th, we have the first multicellular life. On Christmas Day, we get dinosaurs. Around 6:30 on December 30th, we get primates. At 11:52 on New Year's Eve, human beings arrive. 8 minutes to New Year's. We show up on the scene. At 11:58, we start creating sculptures and paintings. At 11:59 and 32 seconds, we create agriculture. At 11:59 and 49 seconds, we invent the wheel and the alphabet. 11:59 and 59 seconds, we get the writings of Shakespeare, the King James translation of the Bible, the invention of the telescope, the train, the skyscraper, the Broadway musical, recorded music, movies, television, the car, flight, the computer, the iPhone, Star Wars, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. All that time, stars forming, black holes forming, galaxies forming, the Earth forming, moons forming, mountains forming, volcanoes forming. All that time, things occurred based on natural laws. And then we come along and we take things that were formed through natural laws and we form them into a different shape. We find metal and we shape it into a car. We shave a sheep and we make it into a sweater. And then we look at that and we say, hey, we created things. And then we use the fact that we molded stuff that already existed into new things. And we take that and we say, well, there must be a God who is like us. And he must create things like us, even though we're the new guys in town. I don't know about you, but I think that comes off as pretty arrogant.
If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe.
All right, I've got 3 more questions for atheists. Here is number 1. Do you believe that our beliefs ought to be proportioned to the evidence? So should we only really believe something if we've got evidence in favor of it?
Yes. Of course, things slip through that we don't think of, and we can all be fooled. But yeah, you should try your best not to believe things that aren't true.
Number 2 is, if we could verify that some miracle actually occurred, would that give us a reason to think that God exists? And again, this is contingent on whether or not we could actually verify that the miracle happened.
If you could prove that a miracle happened, that would give reason to accept that there could be something supernatural at play. And you could say that that moves the dial closer to accepting a God claim as one of the possible reasons. And just remember that all religions have miracle claims, so it doesn't really narrow it down to yours.
All right, number 3, and this is my final question. If you're an atheist that cares about truth and thinks that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, but then you also think that we've got this unique way to verify whether or not God exists through studying miracles, how many of the millions of miracle reports throughout history have you actually deeply investigated?
A fair number, yeah. I've looked into a lot of miracles, and a lot of them are just things that could be explained by natural, non-supernatural means. Saying, how do you explain the millions of miracles, makes it sound like an impossible task. But you don't prove something to be true by saying if you don't disprove a million of these claims, we assume the ones you didn't disprove are true.
Miracles are one of those things that sits right at the divide between believers and skeptics. For Christians, they're evidence of God's glory. For atheists, they are fairy tale magic for people that never grew up. And there's this ceaseless rebuke from atheists that is recited so frequently that it's hard to associate it with anything resembling free thinking. It's the audacious claim that there is no evidence for God. While there are plenty of logical arguments that can be offered as evidence, I think that miracles are the most convincing.
Disagree?
Humans have always been really good at assigning supernatural explanations for things that we later know to be not supernatural. There are plenty of reasons why people will want to see miracles where there aren't miracles. Millions of people saw a creepy man make the Statue of Liberty disappear. The only difference is we knew that that was a trick. There have always been sorcerers or conjurers and psychics and miracle workers because humans have always been easy to fool. There's a thing called pareidolia, where humans have a tendency to see a face where there isn't a face. So that becomes a face on Mars, a face in your outlet, or Jesus on toast. Pipes sometimes leak on statues, and some people interpret that as Mother Mary crying.
Hey, what if it's a sign? You guys remember I wanted to be a priest. That's a water stain.
Or
The
it
pipe
could
leaked.
be a sign that we need to get our pipes
Like,
fixed.
what if it's a miracle?
No,
it's a miracle.
not a miracle.
Well, listen. It could be a miracle. It could be bullshit. There's only one thing we know for sure.
What's that?
It's a goddamn gold mine.
One of the questions that come up, I've seen a few times in comments I've had myself, are there any actually medically attested miracle claims where we have like the x-ray or we have the doctor's testimony? Like talk about maybe as a whole how many there are, and then maybe give one example that you think is a compelling case.
One book that was published decades ago by Richard Kasdorf, it includes the medical documentation, it includes the names of the doctors who reviewed it, which today you'd probably get in trouble for the HIPAA laws, but I think he cleared it, got their permission anyway. But one of the cases in there was of Lisa Larios, who had metastatic hip cancer, and it had actually eaten away her bone. She just knew she couldn't walk. She didn't know it had metastasized and that she was dying. But her mother took her to a healing crusade, and whatever you think of healing crusades or healing meetings, it doesn't really matter because nobody actually laid hands on her or prayed for her there. It was just in that atmosphere of faith. The person up front said, I feel like God is healing somebody's hip cancer. She didn't even know that she had hip cancer per se. She just knew that she couldn't walk, something was wrong. Her mother knew, but she didn't know. Suddenly she jumps out of her wheelchair and starts running around. And you say, that's just adrenaline. But, I mean, she was completely healed from then on. And the medical documentation, the x-rays, shows that not only was she healed of the cancer, but where her hip bone had been eaten away, it grew back.
Craig Keener is one of the go-to people when it comes to evangelicals promoting the idea that miracles still happen today and that miracles are proof of God. Even though those books are just retelling stories and he does no personal research to verify that these miracles actually happened. He's just retelling stories that people told about miracles that have happened. But let's look at the first miracle he says when asked about a verified miracle. And let's start with where it happened. He said it was at a healing crusade and then immediately had to qualify that.
Her mother took her to a healing crusade, and whatever you think of healing crusades or healing meetings, it doesn't really matter because nobody actually laid hands on her or prayed for her there. It was just in that atmosphere of faith.
Because most people today know that faith healers are con artists. We know what tricks they use. And we know how the con works. And even many faithful Christians who do believe in miracles will at least acknowledge that these people are frauds. So not only was this event at a faith healer event, it was at the mother of all modern faith healers, Kathryn Kuhlman, a woman who is shown to be a charlatan using all the same tricks of the trade that are used today. And the book he's referring to is this book, a book written by someone who was already a huge fan of Kathryn Kuhlman, who didn't bother pointing out that another researcher went to one of her crusades and followed up with every supposed healing, only to find out that none of them were healed, and one actually died the next day because she should have listened to her doctor and not gotten out of her wheelchair, but Kathryn Kuhlman insisted that she did, and she injured her spine, causing her to die the next day. And this is the girl he was talking about, Lisa Larios, at 14 being interviewed with her mother by Kathryn Kuhlman.
Your mother's standing there in this state of shock. Did you start running? What happened?
Then we went upstairs, and they said, "You sure you can walk?" And I'm positive. So then the others took me up to the front of the line, and then you started talking to us, and you made me run across the stage, and I ran.
And 18 doctors know all about this.
Oh, yes. All the records are in the Children's Hospital. Anybody that wants to check, it's under her name in the Children's Hospital.
I don't know how things worked in the 70s, but I highly doubt you could just call a hospital and get someone's medical records. What would have made more sense is for the patient who had been healed to get her own records and maybe showed it to skeptics who weren't involved with this ministry to get the word out about this verifiable healer.
The last time we went was 3 months ago. We're still going every 3 months to the Children's Hospital. And we went 3 months ago, and they say she is completely cured. restored. There is no tumor left or anything.
You mean there isn't one
Nothing.
trace of it?
It's gone now, completely.
What do they say about the bone now in the leg?
It's completely healed. She has a complete bone right there in her heel.
A perfect bone.
Perfect bone. It's mended.
I'm not a body language expert, but if you have any relatives who are teenage girls, or if you have been a teenage girl before, you may know that look. That's a teenage girl saying, "What are you talking about?" When you look up how the sex creep made the Statue of Liberty disappear, you kind of lose all awe you had for the illusion. I won't spoil it for you here, but believe me, it's disappointing. And that's true of a lot of magic tricks. Just don't look into them. Let yourself be awed.
Illusion, Michael.
People believe stories like this because of the human factor. These people seem really nice, really sweet. Why would they lie? What would they have to gain by this? I don't know their story. I do know that Catherine Kuhlman was a master manipulator who needed content for her shows and content for her books to keep people coming to her crusade. Crusades that make you wonder why God would use that method anyway. If God wants to heal people, why put on a stadium concert to do it? Why not send your miracle worker to a children's hospital and clear it out? Send everybody home healed. That story would spread. That story would make people have faith. But Trevor, didn't you listen to Craig Keener? All that information's in the book. All the documentation's in the book. So yes, the book does have x-rays. The x-rays don't really say a lot, and we don't really have any way to confirm that they're actually her x-rays. And yes, it does mention one doctor, but it says that he was the one who diagnosed her. It never says that he confirmed the healing. We also know that cancer sometimes goes into remission. I also couldn't find anything about where Lisa is today. It's hard to track down anything from this case because it's over 50 years old, but this is still one of the most commonly quoted cases when people are asked to name a verified miracle. And case after case, it's the same thing where it's either obviously a fraud or there's just no good documentation.
It's a miracle!
No, ultraswade is a miracle. This is just good timing.
Now, I'm sure that the skeptic would agree that miracles are only possible if God exists.
You could probably say that they're only possible if the supernatural exists, but that doesn't necessarily mean God, and it certainly doesn't mean the God of the Bible.
But because the skeptic will often assume that God doesn't exist in advance, then he'll say that miracles are impossible. He'll say that pretty much anything that appears to be a miracle can't be a miracle because it's impossible for miracles to happen. So again, we have a criterion that asks us to prove miracles, but then rules out any possible evidence for miracles in advance. Countless examples like this could be given. But I gotta ask, does this sound fair to you? Or does it sound more like cheating?
Is it fair that we test this claim the same way we test every other claim? I think so. Okay, let's move on to some philosophical arguments for God's existence.
Philosophical arguments aren't good enough. You need empirical evidence.
Definitely not saying that you can't use philosophical arguments for God. I just don't think they're as strong. Again, they have their place and I won't discount them outright, but philosophical arguments are prone to fallacies, like the beg in the question fallacy that I've explained with the soda sweating dragon.
You need empirical evidence for what?
Yeah.
Can you give me empirical evidence that you only, for the claim that you only need empirical evidence?
Right.
You can't do that. That's itself a philosophical claim. It pulls the carpet right from out on the rug of that.
Yeah, the responses to philosophical arguments are often philosophical arguments, right?
Yeah, you can empirically prove that philosophical arguments fail. You simply take a number of philosophical arguments and compare them to the real-world evidence around it. Many pre-Plato philosophers argued that the Earth was flat, but now we know that the data shows otherwise. And many modern armchair philosophers also make that same argument, even though we know that the Earth isn't flat.
Okay. Leading scientist admits Earth is flat. Right there on truthwarriors1.biz. Refute that. I dare you.
Now again, I strongly believe that philosophy is an important part of the conversation and a great starting point for discovery, but I don't think arguments alone work for understanding the world around us.
And the moral argument says if there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one, like it's wrong to torture babies for fun, or it's wrong to murder 6 million people in a Holocaust, then there has to be a God. Why?
Didn't God murder babies and entire families in a flood? And there was probably some babies in those cities he burned. And then he also sent armies to kill women and children. Except, of course, the women and young girls he told them to keep as sex slaves.
Because if there is no God, then everything's just a matter of opinion. That would be just your opinion against a baby torturer's opinion, or your opinion against Hitler's opinion. But we all know, Alan, those things aren't just a matter of opinion.
What's wrong with opinions? We listen to people's opinions all the time. We care about the opinions of those around us. Somebody has an opinion on what would make the world better, or would make their town better, or would make their country better. They start to talk to other people, and they convince people, and then they test out that opinion. And if that opinion works, sometimes that opinion becomes law. That's how societies have always been formed. Opinions winning out over other opinions. Sometimes the bad opinions win, and we need to fight back against those bad opinions. But the phrase, "that's just an opinion," doesn't make any sense. Opinions are very powerful tools.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
That it's really wrong to torture babies for fun. It's really wrong to murder people. If that's the case, there must be a standard beyond us, who is the standard of goodness, righteousness, and justice. And any deviation from that standard is what we would call evil. That standard is what everybody knows to be God.
If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is to say, in the absence of God, everything becomes socioculturally relative. 2, but objective moral values and duties do exist. There are some moral absolutes, some objective values and duties. 3, therefore, God exists.
Again, this is a syllogism that is just a begging the question fallacy. We understand where our opinions come from and how we form opinions. We don't need to appeal to a morality monster or an opinion fairy. We can understand where morality comes from without having to attribute it to a god.
Now, this is an argument which is impossible, I think, to ignore, because every day you get up, you answer by how you treat other people, whether you regard them as having intrinsic moral value or whether they are mere means to be used for your ends. And so this argument, I find, tends to be the most convincing for people.
Human beings developed empathy because we know that we don't like to be in pain, so we don't want to cause pain for others. And societies are better, families are better, friend groups are better if you cause less pain to those around you. If you really believe that the only thing keeping people from treating everyone as a means to be used for their own ends is that there's a moral lawgiver, then you have a very, very low view of humanity and you call your own argument into question.
I mean, even Stephen Hawking, who was the top physicist in the world until he died about 4 years ago.
There he is. Seize him.
Who said that? Said this: almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. In other words, there was a starting point for space, time, and matter. And so this is not even controversial anymore. People are admitting this.
Do you know why people are admitting this when they used to not admit this? Because science is all about disproving what we once held to be true.
The only thing that's controversial, Alan, is what caused the beginning.
It's not controversial. We just don't know. And admitting that we don't know something helps us to do the work so that eventually we might know it.
The idea that the universe has always been here is no longer scientifically possible. Everybody's run away from that. So that means that the universe had a beginning, which then begs the question, what caused the beginning and how did that work?
So the universe had a beginning. Everyone agrees on that. So it can't be an argument for one side if both sides agree.
Well, the universe has a beginning.
Right.
That's the point. So you think about stars, like our sun uses up hydrogen to produce light and energy that spreads through the solar system and further afield, and it's using up its hydrogen. And it's still there and it's still burning up its hydrogen, so the amount of hydrogen is limited, so eventually it will run out of hydrogen. Now we're here having this conversation, so obviously it hasn't run out of hydrogen. So it had a beginning, and every star in the universe is like that. The fact that there are stars, that they're actually still burning, means that the universe had a beginning.
And that, so Christian or atheist both believe the same. The universe had a beginning.
That's right. Just about everybody believes the universe had a beginning, because that's what modern science tells us. I mean, this is an aspect of what's called the second law of thermodynamics.
Right.
Which is it's a dispersal of energy, that things are running down, that things are running out. They don't just wind up by themselves. And consequently, the universe has been running down, and then you can put a time frame on it and so on. They do that. But there's recognition that there's a beginning.
Nobody is denying that, though. We just don't buy your explanation about what caused that beginning.
But listen to what he says. He says, this kind of beginning to the universe had to be, and listen to how he defines it, had to be imposed on the universe by some external agency. Question mark? If only there were some system of belief that
said there's an external agent acting.
Yeah, to bring about the world.
So there has to be some source for soda. If only there was a being that fits that description.
Well, we would call that God. We would. Stephen Hawking rejects that and says, no, it's not the direct intervention of God. But he coins it, and I'm still not sure that I understand it entirely, but he says that there's a parallel existence that he calls literally imaginary time. I'm not making that. It's his word for it. Imaginary time, which is easily mockable.
Easily mockable if you're a podcaster who thinks they are smarter than Stephen Hawking.
I'm Stephen fucking Hawkinson.
Ugh, never mind.
You know, that brought in all of our existence in our universe. And so when you have the smartest guy in the world who's looking at all the evidence and ultimately concludes, like, there has to be an external agent that's bringing about everything we see today because the universe had a beginning, period. And now when you in the ancient world, all the atheists, it was easier to deny the existence of God because they would just say, oh, matter, the universe, the earth, it's existed forever. We don't need a God. It's just always been here. Nothing created it. It just is. But now that you find that there's a beginning, atheism has a really, really high hurdle to say, how did it get here?
Yeah, the burden of proof is different.
The burden of proof is way different because we know things weren't always here. There was a beginning.
No, atheism doesn't have any hurdles. If I'm trying to prove that a God definitely doesn't exist, then yeah, maybe there'd be some hurdles because it's really hard to prove a negative. But not accepting your proposed answer isn't a hurdle. We'll just continue to do science and we'll continue to try to figure out what that cause was. Not having the answer doesn't mean that we default back to the closest religion. It means we keep looking for the answer.
Then you need to explain where did it come from.
Right.
And at least the Big Bang idea recognizes there's a beginning, but then you have a problem. What caused it?
That's not a problem. That's a question. Questions are good. It means we get to find out something new.
Because something with a beginning. Like if I said to you, the chair you're sitting on, nobody made it, it just made itself, it just popped into existence, you would say, man, you need a psychiatrist.
True. Principle of cause and effect.
The principle of cause and effect is an absolute principle of science.
Yes.
You know, so it says what caused the universe.
How do they explain that? Because it seems like, well, the cause must be God. There must be a God that created what we see now.
Why does it have to be a God? Why must it be that?
And what you're also saying is that, well, because of the second law of thermodynamics, things were wound up at one point to the point where now they can be unwound. So who did the winding up and who was there at the beginning?
Yeah.
Why does it have to be a who?
So that's the question. That's the problem for the atheists. So because they've got clever ways of trying to explain how the universe came from nothing.
Yes.
Which is ultimately what they have to try to explain.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but I've never seen nothing do anything. But they have to try to believe that nothing created the universe just by itself with no cause whatsoever. It's like magic.
Magic is the one where someone says a word and then a thing appears, right? No, you don't have to believe that something comes from nothing. We just don't know what happened yet. How do we go from not knowing to having to believe that nothing caused the universe? Admitting that it's okay not to know something is the opposite of having to believe something that there is no evidence for. But this is all just a setup for the Kalam cosmological argument.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something can't just come into being from nothing. Secondly, the universe began to exist. I think we have both good philosophical arguments and scientific evidence for the finitude of the past, from which it follows, third, therefore the universe has a cause. And when you do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe, you arrive at a being.
Then never explain how they arrived at a being at all.
Which is an uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful personal creator of the universe. So for me, that is a very convincing argument for God.
And then they never explain why it has to be all these things. They just assert it. We know the rules of our universe because we're in it and we can study it. But we don't know the rules of other universes. And we don't know the rules of whatever it is that would cause a universe.
The cause of the universe can't be material. It can't be physics and chemistry like our universe. It had to be something which can be eternal. Something had to be eternal. And what can be eternal? Physics, matter, and energy can't be eternal. But a spiritual being, a non-natural being, a supernatural being, entity, can be eternal. And that's, funnily enough, the Bible describes God in those terms.
We don't know that. It doesn't really matter if it's eternal or not, especially since time itself started with the Big Bang. So the concept of eternal might not even make any sense. I think it's pretty hard to describe something as having to be a spiritual being when we haven't been able to study a spiritual being to determine what has to be a spiritual being. I mean, you can posit it as an option, I guess, but to say it must be this, or that it's more likely to be a spiritual being that caused the Big Bang, is a huge leap.
What if then the atheist says, okay, maybe there's an explanation, but I don't know what it is and you don't either?
I'd say, well, let's try to figure out what the explanation is. Let's try to think that through and determine some of its properties.
Okay, but neither of us are cosmologists, so maybe we could just leave it to them and see what they find? I don't know how to study what caused the Big Bang, and I don't think this guy does either. I'm not saying he's not smart, it's just not his field. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean we can't talk about it. We can talk about these things, but I'm not going to be the person that actually figures out what caused the Big Bang, and I don't think he is either. Sure, you can explain it with your God, but that doesn't mean that's the answer. That doesn't mean that's the right answer.
And this is something I also do with the Kalam argument. That for many atheists, Matt, what's funny is we don't necessarily debate on Kalam whether the universe began. They'll say, even if it began, I don't think it's God. Then I'll say, okay, but let's go through the list of candidates.
Right.
Could it be another universe? That's possible.
Yeah.
I am open to the idea that there is a multiverse. That could be very interesting. God is a grand creator. Who knows? He could have created other universes. It's possible. I don't know how many or if he did. But even if our universe exists because of another universe, that once again, we're back to the original argument. What explains that universe?
The multiverse, even.
Yeah. And so it would be the same as asking, why is that chandelier up there hanging over our heads? Well, there's a chain. Why is that chain? Another chain. Why that chain? Another chain. An infinite number of chains doesn't explain why it's hanging up at all. You need something that exists in a not chain-like way, the anchor in the ceiling.
And we might always have to go back further in the chain. The chain might never stop. We don't know. But that doesn't mean we should stop going back in the chain. That doesn't mean we should stop looking. Just because somebody's happy with the answer that God did it, doesn't mean the rest of us should stop questioning things, should stop looking into things. Maybe you go back further enough, we do find God. Maybe we just keep going back further. I say scientists should keep looking.
Did anyone else see that? Unbelievable. It's a second Big Bang.
Much the same way, a bunch of universes or an infinite number of universes doesn't explain why any of the universes exist at all. Okay. Why is there this entire chain of existence?
Suppose somebody concedes that and says, okay, there must be an explanation, it must be necessary, but that's a long way away from saying it's the Christian God or even a personal being.
Sure. And what I would say here is then we have to go through the different categories. What kinds of things are there that do exist? We could see this thing, if it's necessary, then it's not something that is spatial or temporal.
Why?
Because those things they're contingent. They're dependent on other things in order to exist within a space-time framework.
Okay.
So anything that's material is going to be depending on other material forces and entities to constitute what it is, bring it into existence. To be within space and time is be bound by those things. You would be dependent.
Okay.
And to be material means you depend upon space to exist. There's no space, there's no you. Then if we go forward from that, we would say, okay, whatever this causes, it's immaterial, it's timeless, it's necessary, it just has to exist in some way. It cannot be dependent on anything else. If it were to depend on something else for its existence, whatever this cause is, it would not be necessary.
Yeah, whatever caused the rules for this universe may not have had the same rules for itself, but that doesn't mean it's a god. In a sense, it's timeless in that it caused time, at least time how we know it in this universe, but it's only necessary in the sense that if it didn't exist, we wouldn't be here. That doesn't mean it's necessarily necessary, but just that if we're talking about it, then it must exist. But maybe we could have easily just not existed. Like, for example, my parents were necessary for me to be born, but that doesn't mean they were necessarily necessary with a full stop. It just needed to exist in order for us to exist. That doesn't mean that there's not something else that needed to exist in order for that thing to exist.
And he's saying it is amazing that the expansion rate is just right for the existence of Earth to come about, right? And to exist. And he says this, quote, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, that's a 1 with 17 zeros behind it.
Crazy.
The universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size, which is wild. Absolutely wild.
Yeah, 1 second of that number sounds crazy.
Yeah, and that's just one factor out of dozens or hundreds of factors that has to be absolutely spot on to that degree of precision. 1 over 1 with 17 zeros. It goes even a slight bit in either direction, the Earth can't exist. Life certainly can't exist.
Crazy.
And so when you think about that number, I was trying to figure out, okay, how would I explain how tiny the odds are of that? I went to Google Maps and their satellite images. Every pixel that makes up Google Maps. So if you pull up Google Maps and you see the whole world, you look at your city, your neighborhood, your house, your backyard, whatever. Every single pixel of the entire world in that program comes out to be 1.5 terapixels. So 1.5 times 10, 1 with 12 zeros. So this is a huge number.
Yeah, big.
So you'd have better odds picking one random pixel correctly on the entire Earth.
It's crazy.
And then being struck by lightning.
There are 52 that's 52 exclamation point, different configurations that a deck of cards can make. That is 8.0658 times 10 to the 67th different ways that this deck could be shuffled, meaning that it is pretty much impossible that two decks have ever been shuffled the same way. That was unique. This deck, as it is shuffled now, has never been shuffled in this order before. So if somebody came, picked up this deck, started going through it, and said, what are the chances that just a random shuffle made it in this order? It'd be 1 in 8.058 times 10 to the 67th power. Wow. Somebody must have purposely put it in this order. What are the chances? And that is what we're doing here. We're looking at it where it's at now and saying, what are the chances it got here? That's looking at it backwards. You can't talk about chance after the fact. Earth wasn't anyone's goal. Human beings weren't anyone's goal. This is just kind of what happened. We're able to survive on this planet because we adapted to surviving on this planet. And if we didn't adapt, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Then for that one factor to be that precise and spot on.
And that one factor coming from Stephen Hawking, who has no skin in the game for Christianity being true, has no skin in the game for a creator happening. He's just saying, okay, I'm looking at the raw data and I'm saying that's the number.
Yeah, and I would say maybe he does have a dog in the fight
on the other side.
On the other side.
Yeah,
like
makes sense.
He's gone to great lengths to argue against Christianity. But he says the remarkable fact is that the values of those numbers seem to have been finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. So who's adjusting?
Hey, Stephen Hawking! Aren't you that physicist that invented gravity?
Sure, why not?
This is A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, a book that he is quoting here, a book that he has probably not read because this quote can be found on a bunch of creationist websites. He's quote mining it to prove his point. But the thing is, if you actually go to this page that is talked about, he's talking about the strong anthropic principle here, and he's not talking about it as something he necessarily is pushing for or necessarily agrees with. He's just talking about different principles and different theories on the Big Bang. So even in this quote that he's quoted as saying here, he's not talking about this as fact. He's just talking about how this would be in this model that he's describing that he doesn't even necessarily push as his own idea. That's quote mining. I mean, they do it with the Bible, and here they are doing it with Stephen Hawking.
This is why a lot of atheists have said, the fine-tuning of the universe is like the strongest argument they think for God's existence. Let me give you an example of a very simple way to see this. Let's say you watch a video, and it's one of those like contraptions where someone like rolls a little tennis ball, and it rolls down a ramp, and then it hits a little thing and dominoes go by, and then something else cool happens, and it hits something else, and it launches a thing over there, and 100 little things happen, and finally in the end, it like turns on a coffee maker. If you see something like that happen, you know it was designed because you're looking at it going, this wouldn't have happened on accident. And this is kind of the fine-tuning argument is like, it's like saying if this was random, if the universe wasn't designed for life, we wouldn't have life. There's too many specific dials that have to be in just the right spot. And if you moved it a millimeter, no life in the universe.
But that's kind of like saying you've seen a drawing of a tree, so it's ridiculous to say that trees exist in nature. We know things cause other things. We call it the butterfly effect. For example, Twinkies. They have a vanilla filling in them, right? Well, it used to be banana flavored. Why is it vanilla now? Well, because in 1914, someone took a wrong turn. In 1914, somebody tried to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand with a bomb, but it didn't succeed. Franz Ferdinand and his wife decided to visit the people who were injured from that bomb in the hospital. At one point, the driver stopped because he took a wrong turn, and then another assassin was surprised by his luck that Archduke Ferdinand had been hand-delivered to him, so he ran up and he shot him. This assassination led into World War I, which led to about 16 million deaths, and eventually the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was used by the Nazi Party in Germany to rile people up and led directly into World War II, which led to the death of about 80 million people, and led to rationing in America, including the rationing of banana, which caused them to switch to vanilla in the Twinkie. Everything, life, history is all one big Rube Goldberg machine. And sometimes people create their own Rube Goldberg machine. That doesn't mean that the thing they copied has to be designed by a creator.
Is if you look at the way that there's so much order into the world, it just feels commonsensical that there has to be a designer to it. Like there is so much precision and order to everything in the way that it's created, that the idea that it spontaneously emerged from mere chance seems more absurd than the idea of there being a designer that brought it about.
Yeah, I think we all feel that. I mean, there's a beauty to the earth that when you look at it, you're like, there has to be something more than just a bunch of cells spontaneously coming together and creating this beautiful scene that we see.
But just because something seems commonsensical doesn't mean it is true. We know that chance is a factor in so much of our lives. We know the universe is really, really frickin' old. And we know that the laws of physics are constant, and thus planets and stars and moons have formed over time as the elements and rocks and everything cling together due to gravity. And we know that if there were no universe, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If there were no humans on Earth, we wouldn't be having this conversation. In most of the universe, there isn't life. In those places, there isn't the ability to have this conversation. On most of the planet that we live on, humans could not survive because of the ocean. We just happen to have lucked out, For now, because just like most of history, humans didn't exist. There's going to be a very big chunk in the future where humans don't exist.
Hey, what was the purpose of life anyway? Who knows? Probably some hogwash about the human spirit. Sounds about right.
Second argument is the argument from the design of the universe, that if the universe were slightly different by any one of a number of factors, virtually imperceptibly, Alan, this is called the fine-tuning of the universe, there would be no universe, or there would be no universe that could support life. So the universe appears to be fine-tuned for life to exist and even for chemistry to work.
So we're sitting here on a planet that is mostly uninhabitable for humans, in a universe that is mostly uninhabitable, talking about how the universe was finely tuned for us by God.
We live in the habitable zone of our galaxy. So if you look at the Milky Way galaxy, what kind of galaxy is it?
Spiral.
It's spiral, and it has these huge bands that come out. And what happens is there's all kinds of dust and meteors and comets and everything else. That's what those bands are made up of. If you live in there, chances are your place is going to get pummeled with different things flying around. But we just so happen to live in one of the safe little non-busy parts of that galaxy.
We've mostly adapted to survive on this planet because other organisms first adapted to survive on this planet, and as a consequence of that survival, the air became breathable. And because of their adapting and surviving, we have food to eat. But we also have to make our own adjustments because we've moved so far in this planet that we have to light fires, and we have to wear jackets, or we have to invent the air conditioner.
If that's different, our Earth would not exist for so long.
Could you imagine? Just things flying through space and hitting us all the time.
Yeah.
We'd be like, what are we doing here?
Mass extinction event every time that happens. Like it wouldn't be conducive to life.
That'd be scary.
But Earth has had mass extinction events, and one of them famously included a giant asteroid. It's just that life has this ability to adapt, just like we've adapted to the planet that we live on.
So then you have another one, non-eccentric neighboring orbits. So when you look at our solar system, everything moves in its own lane. You know, you don't have ones that are like doing this stuff to where you're barely missing them every time it's revolving around the sun.
Yeah, we're not crossing our fingers thinking, oh.
Yeah, I mean, we have Pluto that kind of does a little bit of a weird thing with its...
Do we count that as a planet anymore?
I do.
It's been up and down since I was a child, so
I'm on Team Pluto.
Okay.
I got mad when they took it off and happy when they added it back in. Yeah. So, but here you have, like, there's the moon. The moon's rotation around us is so perfect with the tides and everything else that are absolutely necessary to sustain life, because if our oceans and lakes and rivers went stagnant, then Earth would die. Like, we would lose our population, the food chain would get all messed up. So even the way that the moon's distance as it rotates, perfect. The way that it revolves and the way that it rotates around us and the tides and everything else, perfect. Our star type. You ever think of that?
I've never thought of those words.
Like when we get solar flares, it messes up with the Earth. And those are just minor solar flares on the surface of the sun. But in a whole 93 million miles away from us, our sun stays at the same heat. It just continues to generate consistent energy. You go to some other stars that are like...
Nobody's ever claimed that evolution is spontaneous. It is a very, very long process. And there are also very, very ugly parts of nature, like flesh-eating bacteria. Those are living organisms as well. I wonder where the flesh-eating bacteria were hanging out in the Garden of Eden. What day were they created? I completely understand why somebody would look at these arguments and take them to show that a God definitely exists, especially if it's someone who is struggling with their faith and just wants something to convince them that it's true. But I hope people can at least see, based on what I pointed out here, why these arguments don't convince me and don't convince a lot of people. And maybe it'll get them back to the drawing board. Maybe they'll start creating stronger arguments. And maybe it'll help some people who are on the fence see that it's okay to question things they have been taught. Or maybe I'll just be told that I'm being stubborn, that I'm being emotional, and that I just want to sin. But that's fine. You have to cope somehow. And if bringing people down helps you do it, then I guess you got to do what you got to do. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for making it this far. If you know somebody who might benefit from it, send it their way. Love you all. Kisses.
Work, Sky Moon.